So today there will be 12,000 babies born in the U.S. and many more who will come to this country because their parents want to give them a better chance of growing up, give them a chance for opportunity. And the potential that we see in those babies, think back to whether it was your own child or maybe it's your sister's child or a grandchild, and you look at that baby and you just think of the potential of that little baby. Think of the potential, all the things that baby may become, all the things that baby may bring as that baby moves into adulthood. What I want to talk to you today is about two babies. One of them actually is one of my children. I have 4 children. They're all wonderful in their various ways. They're all complicated in their various ways. But one of them is a young man now, but he was a baby once. And he was born into some tough biological circumstances. He was born very premature together with his twin brother, had some minor, not terrible, some minor brain injury, had some learning disabilities. But he was born into a family that was relatively secure financially, into a community that was very supportive, an opportunity to go to actually terrific public schools, had lots of early childhood experiences, lots of opportunity for stimulating activities. He had a semi-sane family that he was born into, so he had lots of opportunities. Another baby that I want to talk to you about is a young woman named Shoshana. She's a friend of mine from a running group that I'm involved in, and you do these long runs on a Saturday, and as the miles go by, you start to talk to each other. And I found myself next to Shoshana, and after some pleasantries, she began to talk about what she was doing. She's a mechanical engineer, master's degree, very successful. And I asked a little bit about her background, and she told me she was one of 10 children, born in New York City, to a mom who, although her husband was in and out of the picture, was not there regularly, was born into deep poverty, experienced a lot of homelessness, went to multiple schools, in fact was homeschooled by her mom at times because the living situation was so unstable that she was going from place to place to place. So as you fast forward into their teenage years, you've got these two babies, right? They start out in very different circumstances in life. One having some biological challenges, some learning disabilities, but into a pretty good family situation and a strong community. The other child is born into a situation where she's being bounced all over the place. Chris, by the time he was a teenager, was really struggling in school. He was often the butt of jokes because he liked to hang out with the kids who were doing pretty well. That was a good thing, but they tended to make fun of him. So he had some self-esteem problems. He was drawn also to some other peers who were not quite as positive, and he got himself involved in drugs and alcohol and began to get in more and more trouble with the law. Got arrested. I think he set the record for our town that still stands. He's got a plaque in the city hall. I think he was arrested 6 times in a period of about 4 months from, it wasn't bank robbery or anything like that. It was things like throwing eggs at cars, one of which happened to be a police officer's car, that type of thing. Not the brightest choice. Meanwhile, Shoshana turned out to have athletic talent. She also had incredible drive, and she had a mom that just would not give up. And for her, she described her life as a teenager as no time for nonsense, is what she said. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? She said, I knew that if I got off track just a little bit, it was all over for me. Remember, she was one of 10. Most of her brothers and sisters did not do well. But Shoshana, in part because of her athletic ability, in part because of her drive, in part because of her mother's constant pushing her to do as best she could, in part because of the genetic gifts that she was given, in fact, made it through teenage years fairly well, went on to college on a track scholarship, and continued and got her master's. Chris, on the other hand, was this far from going into the juvenile corrections system. He was already in the system, he was on probation, but this far from getting locked up. Now, when Chris got into that much trouble, one of the things you need to know about me is that I used to run the juvenile correction system in a neighboring state, right? So here we are, we got some money. I know a little bit about juvenile correction, so when the probation officer calls and says, you know, I think the best thing for him is we ought to have him spend a little time locked up, et cetera, I said, oh, that's not going to happen. We had a lawyer, we had money, we pushed and we pushed and we pushed, and in fact, by the skin of his teeth, took him a little extra time. He got out of high school, and then he, you know, the synapses started to connect, and he ended up getting into college, again by the skin of his teeth, and he finished by the skin of yet more teeth. And then some more synapses connected, and now he's in the midst of getting his master's in information sciences. He's getting straight A's. He's like a superstar, right? So great story. Shoshana, meanwhile, she ends up getting her master's, gets a great job. She is also a great story. So these two very different babies with very different experiences end up both doing very well. Here's the problem. Chris had multiple off-ramps as he was going through his teenage years, and he took every single one he could find. But he had more on-ramps than off-ramps. So every time he got off schedule, somebody came along. Sometimes it was me, sometimes it was his mother, sometimes it was a teacher in that strong community, sometimes it was friends. Somebody got him back on track. And again, the synapses finally all knitted together, and he's just doing fine. So Shauna, on the other hand, was and is extraordinary. She also had lots and lots of opportunities to go off track. She did not go off track, but she knew if she did, she would stay off track. So here's the challenge. If the opportunity for these little babies to fully develop their potential depends on the one hand of either having sort of extraordinary supports, the way that Chris did, or being an extraordinarily gifted individual, the way Shoshana is, then we're going to leave far too many of our young people on the sidelines because far too many of them don't have those kinds of advantages. So the real question is, how are we doing when it comes to our kids? What do we know about the opportunities we're giving them? Well, the Casey Foundation recently released a report called Race to Results. And we took 12 indicators that suggest whether or not kids are on track. We looked at things like the circumstances of their birth, were they in poverty, how they were doing in school, how their communities, how strong their communities were, educational achievement, et cetera. 12 different indicators, put together an index of 1,000 points, right? So if you had all the opportunities in the world, you'd score 1,000. If you had none, you'd score 0. None of our kids are doing that well. The highest scoring ethnic group were Asian Americans, who scored a 776. White children, 704. Native American children, 387. African American children, 345. Latino Hispanic children, 404. Remember, out of 1,000. White children, 706. Asian children, 776. African American children, 345. Latino Hispanic children, 404. Native American children, 387. This country ranks 29th among 32 developed countries in the odds that you're going to move up the ladder in social mobility. 23% of our children are in poverty, with all the tough odds that go with that. 6.5 million young people between 16 and 24 are neither in school nor are they working. That's more than 4 times the combined number of people in all of the armed services in this country. And by the way, 75% of young people would not be able to enlist in the armed services because they could not pass the entrance requirements. Why? Well, I believe it's in part because we've gotten very, very good at scaling failure. We have a lot of conversation about scale. How do we take good ideas and take them to a scale large enough to make a difference? Guess what, folks? We know how to scale. The trouble is we've scaled a lot of things that don't work particularly well. In fact, we've scaled policies and programs and interventions that build more off-ramps than on-ramps. Things like zero-tolerance policies and mandatory transfer to adult correctional systems and cutting off all supports for young people when they leave foster care at 18. Programs like boot camps that do more harm than good. So-called training schools or reformatories, the kiddie prisons that we send our young people to. Too many schools that fail to prepare our young people to read well enough to write well enough, to do math well enough in order to be successful. Too many workforce development programs that in fact are not preparing our young people for jobs in the 21st century. These are all the things that we're doing to scale up failure, and I know, because I know a little bit about the work that all of you are doing, that the folks in this room are absolutely determined that we will not let that stand, that we will not be satisfied with making kind of small inroads in improving things. We're going to take things to a much larger level. We're going to take things that work to a much larger scale. I want to share with you an example of a Casey program that we think has achieved significant population level scale. But first I want to just take just a minute to explore this word scale. We tend to think of it as, how do you take a program that works and kind of replicate it enough so it's in lots and lots of places, right? We want to scale up from a program that might be in 3 places, let's get it into 100 places. And that's important. But I actually believe that's the wrong kind of scale. We've got to be thinking about, how do we change population level results? How do we scale impact? How do we move the needle for whole populations of kids? And that's what the strategy that I'm about to share with you was attempting to do. Back in the early 90s, there was a movement across this country to build lots and lots of essentially prison beds and jail beds for young people. It was because there was predictions that an entire wave of super predators was about to descend on this country because of the crack epidemic, because of a burgeoning number of adolescents, young people moving into adolescence, and because of some of the other social indicators that we saw. And so no politician could resist calling for people to get tough on juvenile crime. And so we went on kind of an incarceration binge. That was the exact moment where the Casey Foundation decided that we were going to launch the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative, which had the crazy idea that we ought not lock as many kids up, that we ought to find alternatives to that. This gives you a sense of the growth in JDAI from its beginning. We have now been at it for 20 years. We are in 39 states. We're in 254 jurisdictions. 1/4 of all the kids in America live in a jurisdiction in which JDAI is operating. And our results is that in the JDAI sites, the average daily population in the detention centers has dropped by 43%. And in fact, we're now seeing nationally that not only in detention, which is before the child has a hearing, but also in the training schools or incarceration, which is after a child has a hearing, we're starting to see steep declines in the numbers of children who are locked up. Now, this is a kind of a sketch of what we think about as we move to scale. And most folks stop at that replication to tipping point part, right? We develop a program, sort of prove the concept, then we start to do replication. This suggests that we can move beyond that, to broad expansion, to actually moving the needle, to sustaining change over time. It's kind of what we use at Casey as our map to figure out what we're going to invest more in. What I want to share with you is our 3 lessons or hunches about what we think is important in moving to scale. First, follow the science. We are learning more than we ever knew before from brain science about how the brain develops. We're learning about how different genes get activated depending on the experiences that children have. We're learning about the impact of things like adverse childhood experiences, and the more sort of bad experiences a child has, the longer the odds are that they're going to be successful. We're learning about toxic stress that's associated with things like poverty. We're learning about trauma. In other words, we're learning more and more and more about the actual way the very neurons of the brain operate over time, depending on the experiences that folks have. Very importantly, we are learning that the brain is plastic or changeable, if you will, for much longer than we ever thought before. Always had been lots of attention on the very young children. We are now learning the importance of adolescence as a time where the brain is still developing. And more than that, we're learning that what happens during that period of adolescent development is the development of what's called executive functioning. right? So, I had 4 teenagers at the same time, can you imagine? And I always thought, what are they thinking? Of course, my wife and I, years before, said, what were we thinking? But at the time, it was like, what are they thinking? How could they possibly have made that particular choice? How could you throw an egg at a police car, for example? Well, the answer is that in many ways, they're not. At least not in the same way an adult would think. They're still forming that judgment, that impulse control, that ability to balance lots of things going on at the same time, juggling tasks, setting priorities, all that kind of executive functioning that goes into making better choices as an adult. So what this means is that if you think about adolescence and young adulthood, the sort of population that you all are most concerned with, there's a real opportunity here. It's an opportunity that basically it's like a twofer, right? Think about what you need to be successful as an employee. Juggling multiple tasks, impulse control, persistence, all of those kinds of things. Now think about what you need to be successful as a parent. Judgment, impulse control, sometimes a lot of impulse control, persistence, sticking with things, right? So if we can help young adults, especially those who are struggling, develop their executive functioning by taking advantage of this window of opportunity that we still have in adolescence and young adulthood, we are not only helping them be more successful, but we are preparing them to be more successful parents, which gets to the early childhood piece that so many other folks like to talk about. So it's not like there's early childhood over here and adolescence and young adulthood over there, and somehow we're competing for the resources. Investing in adolescence and young adulthood is investing in early childhood, because they, in fact, are the parents, either currently or soon to be, of, in some cases, some of the most vulnerable kids in the country. We also know from some of the work in the programs that have been done around the country, including ones that you all are involved in, that it is possible to teach executive functioning. We don't have to create brand new programs. We can layer into the programs we already have more attention to helping young people develop priority setting and judgment, providing them with coaching, et cetera, so that we can, in fact, develop that effective, that executive functioning. Finally, the other thing that science tells us, which I think is very, very important, is it is possible for one to design a system that is perfectly designed to defeat an adolescent. And very frequently, that's exactly what we've done. I mean, look at it from the standpoint of the user. So you've got a young person who, even if they're a well-functioning young person, has not yet fully developed the ability to juggle multiple tasks, right? And we set up programs and systems that require them to juggle multiple tasks. Young people tend to give up easily because they have not yet developed the full ability for that kind of persistence and frustration tolerance. So we can't give up on them. And yet so many of our programs, if you fail the first time, you're out, and that's it. Often our young folks, because they're normal young folks, won't have a long-term view. They won't have realistic goals. So we need to give them opportunities to explore and to risk and to learn from that. Very importantly, especially young people who've experienced trauma or toxic stress. Now think about juvenile justice for a minute. Young folks who've experienced trauma or toxic stress are very sensitive to certain triggers. What are the triggers? The triggers that put them into a place where their behavior and their own emotions overwhelm them and they start to act out. What are the triggers? Well, if somebody acts angry around them, anger can be a trigger. If somebody expresses disapproval, environments that are kind of chaotic, lots of noise, lots of insults, lots of overstimulation, right? These are all the kinds of things that trigger somebody who's been through trauma into a different emotional state, which often causes them to act up. Now think what we do with a young person who's involved in the juvenile justice system is just one example. We put them into an institution that is incredibly loud, incredibly bright, surrounded by other young people, often whom are angry, and they deal with that anger by spilling out insults. Not all institutions, but many of them are quite chaotic. It's like a perfectly designed box in which to put someone if you really want them to act out and not have an opportunity to improve the control of their behavior. So, follow the science. Second, clear the kludge. Now, there's a professor at Hopkins who wrote a great paper called Kludgeocracy in America. What he was talking about comes from the software field. One of my other kids is a software engineer, and I asked him about this. You know, when you're designing a program, and the program works great for this particular purpose, and then another purpose comes along, what most software developers do is they take the program that already exists and they put a patch on top of it. And they sort of jiggle it around a bit, and it works kind of okay for the second program. And then you do it again for the third and the fourth and the fifth. And what happens is the more you do that kind of programming, right, then the more likely it is that that system's going to crash, because you've got all this kind of odd software buried on top of each other, right? So think of Windows, right? One of the reasons Windows, I hope there's no Microsoft folks in the room, but one of the reasons Windows often has stability problems, or used to before it was totally fixed, is because it's such a complicated program with lots of kludge, lots of excess programming that makes things complicated. Turns out when you think about our human services system, it's buried in kludge, because we take basic programs and we add and we add and we change eligibility. So this funding stream requires that funding stream requires the others, etc. Thaddeus's paper on this, I think, is the word kludge isn't used, but he's got this great paper that talks about the barriers to access that comes from this kind of problem. Whoops. And this is kind of what you end up with. You know, a family at the middle, but you've got all these different programs with all their different requirements, and you end up decreasing accountability, you end up duplicating effort, and you end up eating up the bandwidth that a young person needs as they try to navigate all of this. You know, I'll keep using my own children. Because of changes in their employment and because of new health care law, et cetera, 3 of them had to go through signing up for new health care. And this is not a healthcare.gov story. This is not a knock on that particular website. These young people were not using that website. And these are 3 pretty bright, accomplished folks. They're out in the world. They all have college degrees. 2 of them have master's degrees. And they were totally stuck with trying to figure out what choices to make among the premiums and the deductibles and this, that, and the other. And they all needed a support system. They needed somebody to coach them through it. Well, think about the young person who doesn't have that support system trying to navigate through some of those kinds of those issues. Final lesson is that a bad system will trump a good program every single time. Now, I've spent much too much of my career working in systems reform, and that means that periodically somebody asks me, well, what do you mean by systems reform? And I finally hit on an example that almost everybody gets. Think about the last time you went to the DMV, right? And you're standing in line, and maybe you got a complicated problem, and you're standing in line, and you're thinking about all you need to do in order, what's going to happen the rest of the day, and you're standing in line. And you're standing in line. And as you're standing in line and standing in line and standing in line, you start to watch the process a little bit, and you start to think to yourself, geez, I could do better than this. I could come up with a better system than this. I could figure out some way where we could sort of move these people through and get answers more quickly. And you're standing in line, and you're standing in line. You start to notice that, like, some of the people are going over to this guy over here, and some of the people going over to that guy over there. And it's kind of random, it depends on who's who, and you notice the people going to this guy over here, when they leave, they don't look very happy. And that guy doesn't look very happy. And there's like long conversations they're having in this line. But the folks who are going to this line over there, they're kind of having a good day. They're walking away, they're smiling, the guy looks happy, it's sort of moving kind of quickly, this line's really slow, this line's, and it's random, right? When you come to you go this way or that way, and you start to think, oh geez, am I going to go to this line, or am I going to go to that line? It's supposed to be the same line, right? But, very different outcomes. Now imagine that instead of your license, instead of your registration, that if you go to this line or that line, that the decision that's going to be made is whether or not your child is going to be home with you that night or is going to be going to foster care. That's when a system starts to really mean a lot more than just taking a few hours out of your day. And yet, when you think about the families that we are most concerned about and the young people that we are most concerned about and the impact of the systems that they deal with, that's the kind of challenge that they face. That the person who knocks on their door, is that a person having a good day or a bad day? Is that person well-trained or not well-trained? Well-supervised, not well-supervised? Are they going to spend all their time trying to fill out a 4E eligibility form, or are they going to get to know you? Because they're going to make the decision that determines whether or not your child is going to be with you that night or is going to be in foster care or a shelter. Life-altering decisions, decisions about opportunity, decisions about power, control, connection, being made by complicated systems. Decisions about who can be served, for how long, by whom. Decisions about which youth goes to which service and what the match may be. Now, you know how it's usually done, right? Anybody who's worked inside one of these systems knows this. It's usually who's got the next available slot. Right? It's not what's the best fit for that particular young person. It's who's got the next available slot, who's up next. It's systems make decisions about whether or not you get the needed kind of support services in order to use the system, right? So you might find your way into a workforce development program, and now you've got a training program, and you're all set to go, but there's no attention to transportation or to child care. That's the kind of thing that goes into systems. It's why a bad system will trump a good program. Programs depend on sustainable financing. They depend on accountability. They depend on the right trail of referrals being sent into that program. You can have a terrific program, but if the system is sending you the wrong young people, then it's a mismatch. It's not going to work. It's critical, and it's interesting that I just noticed these gears here. It's critical that if you're going to work with systems, you need to know what gears drive the system. And that brings me to my sort of concluding comments about the performance partnership pilots that I know you've already heard something about, and that the Forum for Youth Investment has had so much to do with making it happen. Karen's work and Thaddeus's work has been amazing. The Federal Interagency Task Force, as folks I think probably know by now, is authorized in the Omnibus Bill. The 2014, 10 communities will have the opportunity to, in essence, blend funding and to blend eligibility systems, et cetera. I want to leave you with just a few thoughts about what this opportunity represents and how there's really a chance to seize on this opportunity to make a big difference. One, I think it will be a big mistake if the performance pilots turn into just an opportunity to test out a few new programs. I think that's important, but I think if that's all it is, it'll be a big mistake. I think there is an opportunity to take bold action on improving systems performance by looking at blended funding that focuses on core results, looking at intake and eligibility processes, looking at things like team decision-making rather than one individual making decisions, looking at how you engage youth and their families more fully, looking at those support services, looking at frontline practice models such as trauma-informed case management so people understand how trauma affects folks and therefore how to better engage them effectively, looking at new kinds of technology in order to support those kinds of decisions. So I think it's an opportunity to do some important system reform. I think it's an opportunity to clear out some of the kludge. Again, I recommend the paper that, actually a series of papers that the Forum has put out on this. I think it's an opportunity to benefit from the brain science, to sort of design the system from the point of view of the young person and the family, and to fit the model with what we know about the still developing brains of adolescents. I think it's an opportunity to build on multiple on-ramps and to simplify enrollment and to put in place navigators to help people, help young people navigate the system. And very importantly, it is an opportunity to incorporate executive functioning as part of the way we think about the programmatic interventions that we do. It's going to be important that we take this opportunity to build evidence about what works and to help all the rest of us understand what's working and also what's not working, because lots of things that will be tried probably won't work. That's okay. Let's make sure we understand what they are. And finally, I think it's really a critical opportunity to prioritize young parents and system-involved young people. In other words, it's an opportunity to turn our attention to those young people who are perhaps struggling the most. It's going to be tempting, I think, and I fear, to tackle the easier problems. Not that any problems are truly easy, but to not turn our attention to those young folks who are parents, those young folks involved in the child welfare system and the juvenile justice system. I think it's going to be absolutely critical that we focus on the toughest populations. And finally, that we use this opportunity to, in fact, think about permanent change in our systems themselves rather than just short-term demonstration projects that then go away and maybe there's a report. So all of what I've talked about in the last few minutes is really hard stuff. The challenges that I talked about earlier in terms of the numbers are daunting. And, you know, I had a breakfast meeting just yesterday with a group of folks back at Casey. These are folks who had come in from all around the country. They were young people. Well, to me, a lot of folks are young. These are folks sort of mid-career who are involved in state-based advocacy organizations. And some of the brightest and most energetic young advocates from around the country had come in for a leadership development program. And we were having a Q&A over breakfast. And one of them caught me a little off guard. And she said, so Patrick, when you think about the future, what gives you hope? I said, huh. And I realized that there were three things, fortunately I had an answer for, three things that give me hope about the future of this country and the future of young people. Number one, you know, those of us who've been around for a while recognize that even when things seem to be awfully stuck, you never know when opportunities are going to emerge. Things can constantly change. So I'm a kind of dyed-in-the-wool optimist. So one of the things that gives me hope is that I know that over the course of many, many years, we see change, and that's when we take opportunity, things get better. So that's sort of a basic, you know, sort of human nature type of thing. That's one of the things. The other thing, though, that gives me hope is the projected and certain change in the demographics of this country. We will be, by 2018, over half of the children in this country will be children of color. By 2030, over half of the workers in this country will be workers of color. And I think it's by 2067, I forget the exact date, over half the people in the entire country will be people of color. This country is becoming more and more vibrant, more and more diverse, people from lots of different perspectives and experiences, lots of different histories, and we are finally going to have to deal in a different way with the differences and the diversity and the possibility that that provides us than we ever had to do before. Because those of us who are white, those of us who are male, those of us who are older, we will have to let go of some of that over control and that fear that we've had for so long, and I think things will just open up. So that's the second thing that gives me hope. And the third thing that gives me hope, frankly, is leadership. Now, I've been an admirer of Karen Pittman for more years than she knows, and I've seen what happens when somebody devotes their life to opportunity for young people. But what really gives me hope, as I was talking with these young state-based advocates, is the next generation of committed, incredibly passionate, energetic, truly brilliant young leaders that are just now coming into their power, coming into their influence. And I promise you, they will change the world. Thank you.